Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. Your host, a behavioral scientist and bachelor, talks to leading experts and successful singles about living solo and living well. Travel more, make things, sleep in when you want to. Here's the playbook for the person who is unapologetically unattached. Now, please welcome Dr. Peter McGraw.
Welcome back. This episode is part of a long series on making remarkable friends. I invite Rhaina Cohen, a writer and NPR producer, to talk about her emerging work on friendship. We discuss how some people are equating the status of friendships to the level of an exclusive romantic relationship. Notably, we discuss the lack of good role models for this style of friendship, and thus people rely on fictitious relationships like Sherlock and Watson or the Golden Girls. We also discuss the special challenge some men have with loneliness due to a lack of friends, a conversation that gets me quite emotional. And we finish the conversation with some tips for making, maintaining, and ending friendships. Speaking of friends, please tell the single ones about this podcast. We are building a movement that destigmatizes single living. Also, for yourself, please considering rounding out your team with more friends. I hope you enjoy the episode. I certainly did. Let's get started. Welcome to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. I'm Peter McGraw. Today's guest is Rhaina Cohen. Rhaina is a producer and editor of narrative podcasts at NPR, previously covered the social sciences for the podcast Hidden Brain. Rhaina has worked on a number of stories about friendship, most recently a feature for The Atlantic called What If Friendship, Not Marriage, Was at the Center of Life? She's working on a book about deeply committed friendships and what the rest of us can learn from those relationships. Welcome, Rhaina.
Really happy to be here.
I'm so thrilled to have you. So this episode is part of a series. I usually say mini-series, but this is turning into a long series, given the importance of the topic, on making remarkable friends. And so solo listeners know I have a saying, which is have a team, a group of personal and professional connections, ideally ones that are interconnected. And obviously, friends are a critical part of that team. And so there's three things I want to cover with you today. That is the status of friendships in society in present day. I want to talk specifically about men and the problems that they have with friendship and loneliness. And then lastly, and maybe the juiciest part, some suggestions for making, maintaining, and dare I say, ending friendships. How's that sound?
Other than ending friendship, sounds like it will be fun.
It's true. Look, relationships have breakups, and that might be best for the two people. And to be honest, I actually don't think that ending friendships is the major problem that people have with friends, but it does happen. So let's talk a little bit about, in your view, what is a friend and what makes a good friend? This is something I've been tussling with.
Wow. I mean, that feels like the most basic, but also like quite a hard question of what makes a friend.
And what makes a good friend on top of it.
Yeah. I mean, a friend is somebody that you have chosen to have in your life who can range from somebody who you are in contact with 3 times a day and live with and is the most important person to you on one end of the spectrum. And on the other could be somebody who you speak to periodically and you have some shared interests, or there was a period in your life where you were supportive of each other and now you just have a shared history that you can return to occasionally. And I think sort of everything in between, but maybe the biggest part of it that distinguishes friendship from a family relationship would be the fact that it's chosen. And I think that I'm defining it in opposition to these other relationships that I have clear definitions for. So I guess there's not blood ties, and that I would say usually, almost always, there's not sex involved, but I think you've complicated that. I'm happy to complicate that as well. That's the best definition I can come up with.
Sure. Yeah, that's not a problem. And actually, I cover this in a previous episode where I go into the dictionary and look at how dictionaries define friendship. And it's surprisingly sort of vague. I define friendships a lot like the Supreme Court defines porn. You know it when you see it. Now, as you were talking, And I said, what makes a good friend? And it's interesting because you talked about the difference in closeness, right? So someone you talk to 3 times a day to someone you talk to occasionally. I had this idea that just popped into my head is like, I think all friends should be good friends.
So I think I don't think I was even answering the good friend question, because I think you can think about that in 2 ways. Like, what is a good friend? Like a kind friend or a decent friend, versus sometimes when people say good friend, they're talking about close friend, best friend, something like that. So yeah, I totally agree with you that I sometimes feel a little bit of like a disconnect when I want to say that somebody's a good friend, and we don't talk that often, but I feel close to them and I feel like they get me more than maybe people who I have more frequent interactions with. So I very much on board with the idea that there are different ways of defining what a good friend is, and that kind of frequency of contact is not necessarily the defining factor there.
Yeah, you can imagine these sort of, or 2 orthogonal, I'm going to nerd out as a scientist for a moment, but these sort of 2 orthogonal dimensions, closeness, like frequency, closeness, distance, and so on, and then goodness, quality. And I like to say it'd be fine to fill the close and far part of it as much as you want, but you want to avoid the bad sections of that. So always good, but close or far, or frequent or infrequent is fine. So I'm going to run by what I've been working to assess the goodness of a friendship, not the closeness, would be 1, the person is appealing. There's something about them that draws you to them. A goodness, a positivity about those interactions. And that could be along a lot of dimensions, I suspect. Trustworthiness. This is someone that you can trust with, most importantly, your secrets, your most intimate types of thoughts, your backstage life, so to speak. Reliability. That is that these are people who are there when you need them. They show up for you, not at their convenience, but for yours. And then lastly, this is a word I've sort of stolen from the poly community, this notion of compersion or anti-jealousy, that good friends aren't fundamentally jealous of your successes, and they don't want to outdo your failures. And so those are the 4 criteria that I invite people to think about the goodness of their friendships. And I'm curious, as someone who's thought even more about friendship than I have, what are your reactions to that?
Yeah, even before you said reliability, I was thinking like that. It's something I keep returning to as so important certainly in making a friendship a more serious one. I can think of a time where I was becoming close with 2 people, one who I had just like a thrill of excitement over meeting, and she turned out to be extremely unreliable, and it was really hard for us to become close. And then I had another friend enter the picture who I think I didn't have that same like intensity of feeling immediately, but I kind of felt like she had so many of the great qualities that this other person had, but was really reliable, and we could see each other consistently and build a close relationship there. So I think reliability is something that's underappreciated, and it feels related to a term that actually that same friend has told me about. Like the sort of 6th love language could be operational competency, like somebody. So, which I think is partly about reliability, but also like if you're planning a trip, can you get that person to organize things? And I just, people who can remove the friction in all sorts of interactions, I find to be really important. And there are people who I adore and whose company I find so exciting, but I don't see us getting to a place where we are really relying on each other in a meaningful way because they don't have those really basic qualities. And I think compersion is such an interesting idea to bring into friendship. I was trying to recall, there's a Yiddish term for feeling that parents have when they're happy on behalf of their children. And I feel like it's like something similar there. And yeah, when you can get vicarious pleasure through a friend's happiness and successes, and I think also feel burdened by their burdens, that if a friend of yours is having a hard time, that's something that is in the back of your mind that you're trying to work through and try to figure out how you help them deal with that. Those things seem incredibly important. I think having related to trustworthiness, probably having a real openness of communication is really important. And I think a lot of the very, very close friendships that I've encountered through the interviews I've done, people have an unbelievable level of earnestness and openness in talking about what they're feeling. So those just might be the things I would add to what you were saying, that those factors all seem very important.
I agree. So the previous episode is on Nietzsche, and his view on friendship, and he believed that friends make you a better person. And they make you a better person for the reason you just discussed, which is they're honest with you. We're not often honest with strangers because we don't want to hurt their feelings. But the idea is that if a friend, as you say, you want them to be better, that honesty is an important part of it. And then the other one is that they have insights about you because they know you in a sense. And so good friends make you better and you make those good friends better. And I think your point about communication is connected to that idea. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship escalator for a moment. So frequent listeners know this term, this idea that there is this one idealized type of relationship in the world, has these criteria. So I'm using the sort of words of Amy Guerin, journalist who wrote this book, Getting Off the Relationship Escalator. And so this idea of there's consistency. So it starts at some particular time, ideally, and it's only really truly successful when one of the members dies. Monogamy, right? There's a intimate connection between two people. Merging, you bring your life together financially and your living arrangements. And then related to our conversation today, it's given special status. It is more important than any other relationship. Your life partner, your husband, wife, so on, is given this thing. And I'm going to say this because I find it striking sometimes. It's given such special status that some new person in a person's life can suddenly crowd out lifelong friends. And that person can disappear from their friends' lives as they cultivate this relationship, perhaps never returning or only returning when the relationship falls apart. And we've all had that experience there. And I was struck by your story in The Atlantic about a couple, friends, who instead placed that special status, that number one status on their friendship. And I'm wondering if you could kick it off and talk about that and talk about your view of the status of friendship in society these days.
Yeah, so I start off the piece with this scene with these two, one woman, Cammie West, talking to this man who she has started dating very recently and says, "You're not my number one and you're never going to be. And I have one in my life. And if you think that you're going to change this and that you're going to come into the picture and be my number one, you're wrong." And basically get used to it. And the person
did she put it that bluntly, or is this?
Yeah, she put it that bluntly. She even put it more compactly than I just described it there. But yeah, she said that talking about her friend Tilly, that her nickname is Tilly, that she was there before you, she's going to be there after you. And speaking to exactly what you were talking about with how friends will be the ones sticking around even if you don't spend time with them. I didn't actually get into this piece in the story, but the man there is now Cammie's partner. And So he is around, and so is Tilly. But sort of line that ends at that section is Cammie reflecting on what everybody else expects, which is to put, a boyfriend or a girlfriend first, and that for her and for Tilly, their worlds are backwards. So, they very much recognize that they have chosen to sort of invert this hierarchy where a romantic relationship is the most important one and everything else will come to the side. And it's interesting as you're describing the relationship escalator, because I can see Cammie and Tilly and some of the other people in the story having something that's kind of similar in the sense that they have decided to orient their worlds around each other. In some cases, they live together and there is a sense of growing intensity, but there are also differences. It's not exactly a repeat of the relationship escalator in that there are no expectations that you're going to have that kind of first comes this, then comes this, and this is a define the relationship talk. That doesn't happen. And to me, what's actually really incredible is that these people who have no steps telling them what to do are in fact escalating their relationship. And for them, it is more like climbing the stairs or something that's a little bit less passive that's happening. And I think also, even though Cammie and Tilly are talking about themselves in this very kind of hierarchical and exclusive way, they're also at the center of a network of friends, and they are relied upon by other people. And it's not as if there's a sort of hermetically sealed relationship and that no other relationships can compete or coexist and still be really meaningful. So while I presented initially as a kind of inversion of the norm, I think what they're doing is presenting a very different model of what friendship and romantic relationships can mean in our lives.
And one of the things I was struck, I mean, I love the story. And it's funny because when I meet a woman, one of the things I tell her is I'm not having children. And I just do that right off the bat. Like I used to do it much more bluntly, like much the way that she did. I've learned to, first of all, not even like assume that that's the case and to be able to address that. And so I do think that that sort of expectation setting is important, especially if you are deviating from convention in a world where people don't even know that it's a convention, right? They don't even think. As you were saying earlier, it's hard to define friendship independent of other relationships. It's very hard to do a lot of things, define a lot of things about single living independent of non-single living. And I think that that's a striking fact about these ideas. You had mentioned the lack of scripts, this lack of thing, and that you have to seek them out. And you had mentioned Sherlock and Watson as a kind of a possible exemplar of a friendship. And I have watched the most recent version of Sherlock on Netflix, the BBC version of it. And it's so funny, these two men, different in so many ways, but supportive of each other. They're both better together than they are separate. And yet everybody thinks they're gay and they're together in some romantic way, which Watson clearly chafes at because he's a little bit of a ladies' man. And so I'm curious about, are there other exemplars? How are people in the folks you're talking to about friendship, how are they where are they learning this other alternative script?
Yeah, well, just on the sort of Sherlock and Watson thing, I mean, there's a term for this that's shipping, like looking at fictional characters or like people in TVs and movies who appear to be friends and then assuming and like writing a plot line in your head as if they're in a romantic relationship.
Say that again. Is it shipping? SHIPP?
Mm-hmm. I guess it's probably like short for relationship.
Relationship. Yes.
Yeah. And, I think like to step back, like I understand why there's a desire, especially among queer people, to see queer relationships where maybe they were not able to be made explicit before or even now. But I do think there's another way of thinking about the urge to see romance, whether it's between people of the same gender or of different genders, that we don't easily understand what very, very close friendships can look like. I think some exceptions and some of the role models that I heard again and again were Oprah and Gayle King. They have an extraordinarily close friendship. Gayle has a wing in Oprah's house. They talk 4 times a day. They're one very public model. I think the Golden Girls is important for a lot of people.
Oh, yes.
And thinking about when I get old, I want to live with a bunch of my best friends. There are, different TV shows like Broad City have come up. There's from Grey's Anatomy, Christina and Meredith, who famously, there's a scene where I think it was Christina telling Meredith that you're my person. And I think that's where that language has come from. There's another show, Insecure, that has a couple of extremely close friends. So there are places in popular culture that I think people are able to look to that are mostly fictional, with the exception of maybe Oprah and maybe Aminatou Sow and Ann Friedman, who have a podcast called Call Your Girlfriend. But for the most part, these are pretty limited models and they don't have them in the real world, people that they know in flesh and blood who have these sorts of friendships.
And it's striking as you give these examples, they're mostly women.
Yeah.
There's a lack. And we're going to get back to that in a moment. But I think that that's worth noting, that we don't have as many examples in fact, in nonfiction and fiction of men doing this kind of thing. Now, what's striking to me is the lack of good words, language. I constantly bump up against the limitations of language when it comes to issues of single living. So you had mentioned the big friendship women, and that's their term for that special status of friendship. What are some of those terms? How do people navigate this beyond the obvious bestie? That's there.
Yeah, I just interviewed a woman the other day who told me there was a period where she was going to a lot of doctors and had to put down an emergency contact. So she put down her closest friend, and she didn't want to put down best friend because that didn't seem quite right to her. And she kept changing it. So she has, I think, on 3 different doctors, 3 different terms for the same person. So one was, okay, well, I'm forgetting the details, but one was like heterosexual life partner. She just kept coming up with different terms because none of them felt quite right. But I think that illustrates how hard it is to find language that's lucid to other people, that doesn't need a whole explanation. And also the desire to really feel seen in these relationships, and that best friend just doesn't really cut it for a lot of people. because they feel like it's juvenile or it doesn't really illustrate the intensity. One thing that I heard was from a woman who was trying to put her friend in her will and was trying to explain to her lawyer, no, this person isn't my girlfriend, that think of a BFF times 20. So that's one way that she's described it. So platonic life partner, platonic life mate, ride or die, platonic soulmate. Those are all terms that I've heard from people that have mostly just been things that people have created, taking pieces of language that already exist and matching it up with other things to make it a little clearer to other people, especially that this is not just your standard issue friendship and that it is really there for the long haul.
Yes, it has that special status. It has that consistency. One of the striking things that I have found as I've been working on this series is that friendship was the most prominent. So the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, talked about friendship in the way we talk about marriage these days. And that a good friend, one of you is going to die at the end, right? You're going to be friends for life in that sense. The decline of friendship, and then perhaps, I'm emboldened to say this, the rise of friendship in contemporary times, in part because of people are delaying marriage. They're not getting married. Divorce, more and more people being divorced, and the critical role that friends play. But the problem is we don't have the right language in that sense.
I think the language issue can cut both ways. So I've heard different things from different people. I think people would be happy to have language that feels more suitable. As your question at the very top asked me, which was, what is a friend? I mean, It is such a capacious term that it can mean almost anything. And even best friend, I've heard people talk about their best friend and it is very different from what other people think constitutes a best friend. I think the flip side of adding more language is that there are going to be people who it doesn't really feel quite right and that they want something slightly different. And that instead, I think the bigger thing that the people in these relationships are asking is for us to be able to imagine relationships that don't fit into a neat category. And I think it's a very hard thing for us to do. I personally think that having some language is probably helpful on some level, and that if every relationship has no lines around it, it creates issues for forms of social and eventually legal recognition as well. So I think the language thing is very important, but it might not be the be all end all, because the bigger ask is for people to be more imaginative about what relationships can be and how the most important relationship in someone's life might not be a romantic one or a child.
Well said. Do you have a particular term that you personally like? Have someone who has surveyed lots of people around this?
I have come to use as platonic partner, and even that is not really a
so boring.
Term. Thanks. Thanks. If you have a better one. So
I don't,
I think the issue is that the connotation of the word platonic now is different from like what platonic meant in the past. The way that I actually started all this down this path was reading about romantic friendship, which is a term that's referring to very intimate, affectionate friendships that have been prominent have existed for about a millennium, but were very prominent from around the 1700s to the turn of the 20th century. And I was looking for modern day romantic friendships. And then I found that a lot of people didn't really feel like their friendship had those sort of elements of like the butterflies of romance. And that instead it felt more akin to a sibling relationship. So I thought that reviving the term romantic friendship might be confusing to some people who feel like overall they fit into this broad category. So that's the provisional term I've been using so far. If you have better suggestions, let me know. Nothing is set in stone.
I'm not trying to be critical. I was trying to be comedic, but I think it's a real problem. And I think that we should add one to this idea of sexual friendships, right? The idea of two people who are primarily friends, but they also happen to be physically intimate, but they don't think of themselves as partners. And in that traditional relationship escalator that's there. And obviously, we're not talking about those types of relationships per se, although they do count, I think, more as friendships than they do in the way, because sexual friendships just from the get-go assume that consistency is not going to be, it's not going to check that box. And so that's a natural deviation from the relationship escalator. So this idea of historically friendships being so prominent, one of the things that I think you talk about Frederick Douglass, and I think that was such a striking example. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Frederick Douglass writes in his autobiography about his decision to escape from slavery, and that one of the hardest factors to make that escape was leaving behind his friends. And he just talks about the abiding love that he has for these men in his life. And I came across this through a book that's about men's friendships and slavery. So his was but one vivid example of that. And my guess is that that is pretty surprising to people these days, that they might imagine somebody really being concerned about abandoning a child or a spouse or a lover. But the idea of even, he basically says that he almost didn't do it, but because of his concern over his relationships with his friends. So there are a few more important things or decisions you could make that would ride on a friendship than deciding to not escape bondage.
Yes, I thought that was so striking. I think it's a testament to how powerful these relationships can be and how important they can be, especially for someone who's going to go out there on their own. I always talk about how solos are more mobile. They're able to make choices and they have options. But to have that sort of constellation of people around you, whether they be close or far in terms of relationship or close and far in terms of distance, can serve as sort of a support system, a buffer, and so on. Obviously, back when Frederick Douglass was escaping slavery, there was no text messaging. There was no Zoom and so on. So let's pivot into talking about men per se. One of the things that I have noticed in general is when it comes to being single, or even this topic of friendship, is that women, I think at times, are faced with the challenges more, but they're also very good about getting help and finding support. And I think a lot of men sort of tend to, they may be suffering, they may be struggling, but they don't either find it or don't have the kind of skills by which to reconcile and to fix these things. And so you were, I think, a producer on an NPR episode about men and loneliness. I read it and I cried as a man, actually. Sorry.
No, it means a lot that it touched you. And believe me, I've gotten emails from people telling me that it made them cry, from men.
There's a scene in that story about a middle-aged man found himself hugging a post in his apartment. I'm sorry. I think that men are unpopular these days. And they do a lot of damage in the world, but I think many of them are kind, decent people who are really just trying to make their way. And I think that there's not a conversation to help them. And in that article, it talks about research asking people who would you call in the middle of the night if you were sick or afraid? And the challenge is when someone can't answer that question to their health. And that term afraid really affected me. The idea that men aren't allowed to be afraid. And that might even inhibit them picking up the phone, even if they have someone. Maybe I should let you talk as I compose myself.
Yeah, I think that men, or maybe heterosexual men, if they're in a relationship with a woman, that might be one space, maybe the only space where they are allowed to be vulnerable. And
even then, at times, they're not allowed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we're so used to men expressing negative emotions in the form of anger rather than sadness. And I'm not privy to all male spaces by the nature of who I am. I imagine that there are some all male spaces, maybe in the military and elsewhere, where there's a possibility of being vulnerable, and that there are norms around that. But I think for the most part, it's very much not, and that men who are friends with one another don't expect to be wrapped up in the other person's arm and crying with them in the same way that I would absolutely expect that of any close friend of mine. Mm-hmm. And it's not to say that every friendship needs to look the same, but I do think that men should be able to have access to the full range of emotions and possible support that women are able to have access to as well.
Yeah.
And the moment that you describe, where this man, who I think by this point he had been divorced twice, and he just didn't have friends in his life, and just wanted to feel wanted that physical connection, and had sought that in romantic relationships and now just wanted a friend. And if you think about it, it is so much easier to go out and find someone to date, to sleep with for a night than it is to find a friend. This is not an example of a man, but one of the women I profiled for the Atlantic story whose friend died, she was so heartbroken afterward and thought, like, I can get intimacy in the form of dating if I want to, but that's not what I want. I want somebody who I can talk to at all hours of the night, who completely gets me. And I don't know how to find that again. And she's going to have trouble finding that person again. But I think about men who probably didn't even have the chance to find a person even close to that kind of relationship, who deeply understands them, because there's a kind of cutoff point at which it is no longer acceptable for what men can say and do in their relationships. And yeah, I think the American Psychological Association, if I'm remembering correctly, has sort of talked about the harms of American masculinity to men's psychological well-being. So friendship is I think one way that these strictures really manifest and mean that men don't have the full range of relationships that they can.
Indeed, yeah. So I'm going to leave that in because it's important for people to know that it's okay to be sad as a man. And I think a lot about these things because I interact with a lot of men. They are my friends, they are my students, they are my business partners, and I see the full range of this. And we're lucky, we're quite elevated. Like, I tell my friends I love them, I hug them, I embrace them. But it took me a long time to get to that space. I'm also very good at making friends and maintaining those friendships, male and female. And so I feel part of my reason I thrive is because of those friendships. And so to hear men who are either in relationships where they would not have a social life if not for their wife, and then when they depart those relationships, oftentimes it's the wife getting rid of the man, divorcing the man. Albeit for good reason, that man is left on an island and doesn't have the skills to bounce back from that and ends up just jumping into another relationship because of the ease, right? You just start swiping and there's lots of options.
And I would just say, I think that heterosexual women have a role to play in trying to make men feel more like they can have friendships. And in many cases, they are pushing the men in their lives to have friendships. It is not in women's self-interest to be, in one term that I've heard, being emotional gold diggers of women and having to rely on them so much. But I do think that for a lot of women, they feel suspicious and uncomfortable if a man has an extremely close relationship with another man that is born of some homophobia. And I think that women should be conscious of their own behavior in how they joke about men who seem especially close, how they see the Sherlock and Watsons who are out there. I am just thinking of a couple of men who I talked to in North Carolina, and they've just heard, who are in their 30s and have been best friends since they were in high school. And they've just heard every single gay joke that you can imagine, and joke of like, have you left your wife yet for, with your, in terms of your like keeping the friendship, or that they're compared to every romantic couple that you can imagine. And they are able to sort of get over it because they're very secure in their friendship, and secure, I think, in who they are as people. But nobody should have to put up with that. And I think that probably the friends around them, men and women, think that they're just gently ribbing them and they really admire their friendship and they don't know how to express it. But I think that all of us should be thinking about what we do to enable or restrict the kinds of relationships that particularly heterosexual men, I think, are restricted in being able to have.
I certainly don't blame women per se. I mean, these are systemic problems, but we're forced to cope with them at an individual level. I have a very close friend, and when we go out, we're well groomed, we're well dressed, we're fit. He's much better looking than I am, but nonetheless, people will often think that we are a gay couple. And that's never been a problem for us. We've never seen it as threatening. If anything, we actually sort of liked it because it made it easier to talk to women because the defenses were a little down and it was just an easier way to say hello, you know what I mean, kind of thing. But I want to get your reaction to an idea about that gentle ribbing. I think it's well-meaning. I think when someone says, "You're so great, why are you single?" I think that is well-intentioned, but actually can be painful and hurtful and so on. And in the same way that joshing around and saying, "When are you two going to let us come out of the closet and let us know?" a previous guest, Chris Marsh, said in the case of "You're so great, why are you single?" What is the perfect reaction to that, response to that? She says, "What do you mean by that?" Just to simply ask someone, "What do you mean by that?" In some ways, I think that reaction or that response to that ribbing of, when are you guys going to just let us all know? And you say, "What do you mean by that?" is a way to catch someone in terms of the assumptions they're making about these kinds of relationships. I'm curious what you think about that. Because again, this is about language and we don't have proper language and ways to talk about these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, interestingly, with the men that I was describing, both of them are married to women and have been for a long time. So it's not even that that they're also single and that people are speculating that maybe they're in the closet or something. Or at least, I mean, it just shows that even they aren't free of it, I guess. But I think when people are asking a question that has judgment underlying it, asking them what they mean and responding with a question that forces them to articulate maybe the things that are not so great that are behind their words seems to me like almost always a good method, whether for the singlehood question or this one.
Yeah, I think that's right. I do like this sort of term. I toss around the term bromance. Like, I think that when there's a sort of an excitement. As an adult man, sometimes I meet another man and I am excited to meet him because in the same way it might be hard to partner up romantically, it's oftentimes hard to partner up as friends, especially as middle-aged men. And I just want to tell you, I was so moved by that episode. I think the other thing in it that was both concerning but also a little bit uplifting were the conversations that you folks had with young boys, mm-hmm. And what highlights this is, again, that's why I say it's systemic, because it's young boys already have this, that there's this sort of 1-2 punch of homophobia and hypermasculinity that make it difficult for men to be vulnerable enough to develop those kind of friendships. And hearing these young boys talk once they were sort of licensed, that it was okay to have friendships, to have these dear male friends in their life, how they sort of reacted to that.
Yeah, the work that I was drawing on there is from Niobe Way, and she's interviewed hundreds of boys, and I've gone to sort of some of the classrooms that she's taught in. And the thing that she found in these interviews was that you talk to boys who are 9, 10, 11, and they talk about their love for their friends. Mm-hmm. And not just like, "I love you, brah," like really that they care so much for that person. And then they sort of start hitting their teenage years and it clearly becomes less acceptable. And she finds that the same boys who were talking very affectionately are suddenly just saying, "Oh, it doesn't really matter to me." And part of it is that the boys start dating and then the romantic relationship that they're interested in ends up taking the place of the friendship. But I think just the sort of emotional distancing in order to appear masculine starts very early. And I think the hopeful part is that this is not a deeply ingrained thing that is unerasable, that mm-hmm. starts when boys are 2, that so much of this is socialized. And she also talks a little bit about some of the other countries that she had spent a good deal of time in, where boys will hold hands and have show a lot of affection. And I mean, you can look both across time and culture to see that the way that men behave in the US and in the West, and how limited their means of affection and depth of connection are, it's not innate. But what we need to, the sad part of the story is just how early boys are getting these messages, and therefore how much work we would need to do to unravel that. I mean, what do you do? You have like a 40-year-old man who's gotten so many messages. I mean, I was just sent a clip from Modern Family where the father, whose name is escaping me right now, who's like in his 60s or something, around there, his wife makes fun of him for saying, "You can't call your best friend your best friend. That's like sort of not manly enough." Like, if you've been getting that kind of messaging obviously it's fictional, but it's speaking to something in the culture that, if you're getting those messages for decades upon decades, like that's a lot of work that individual person needs to undo, and that sort of collectively we would need to undo to get men back to the point where they were boys and loved their friends and could say that.
Yes. So I have 2 reactions to this before we turn our attention to the sort of making and maintaining part of this, because I think for whether you're male or female, this can be useful. So the first reaction is about that idea of intimacy. I'm going to tell a personal story. So this was many, many years ago. I went on semester at sea. I was 26 years old. This was not pre-internet, but this was a time where you communicated through calling cards and letters. And I had a dear friend from childhood and my roommate freshman year. His name is Todd, and he's still a friend today. We're close, but he's a good friend, but we don't see each other often. I gave him my itinerary, and he said, I'm going to meet you in Egypt. And so we were going to meet in Egypt, which was not an easy thing to do because there's no cell phones. And the day the ship arrived in Port Said, I waited on the dock for him, and he didn't show up. And I waited the entire day. And I ended up making friends with these Egyptian guys who had a leather shop that was there in the port. And we just sort of became fast friends. They were fascinated by me. These were the first Egyptian people that I had ever met. And I ate lunch with them and so on. And at one point in time, we went on a walk to go get dinner or something like that. And one of the guys took my arm in his arm. And that has never been something that I had ever experienced before. But this is part of Egyptian culture is men will hold hands, will embrace as they walk in public. And I had been told that this is part of the custom and culture. So I was prepared for it. And I remember simultaneously feeling uncomfortable because it was it was out of my experience, but also touched because I was like, oh, this man is showing me true brotherly affection in a way. And I think that that's a nice example of how these things are determined by culture. That's the first thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of cultures where in that region of the world have this sort of norm around men showing physical affection. I think one of the kind of complicated things in thinking about this is that a lot of the cultures where it is permissible are ones where there's a lot of sex segregation.
Indeed.
and homophobia.
Yes.
So homophobia to the extent where it's kind of beyond the pale to be gay. And I think you might imagine that in the US, where homophobia is much milder, that in general, that it would be easier for men to show physical affection. But I think the fact that it is hard speaks to the latent homophobia that exists, even in people who think about themselves as progressive. And then, with the gender segregation part, if you're a man and you're cut off from women, then it makes sense that you have to find some intimacy with somebody.
Yes,
and
right.
I think there are different sorts of expectations around marriage in a lot of cultures where it's not necessarily that the person that you're married to is going to be the person who understands every part of you, that there are kind of economic imperatives around marriage, and it's a merging of families, that there are different sort of expectations there. I think what I would like to see is just to get to a world where it is possible for men to have these very close friendships and to take each other's arms, but be in a world where there isn't homophobia and where different genders can mix freely. So that's closer to the world that we have in the US. So I wouldn't necessarily want us to revert back to more homophobia and more sex segregation to make these friendships possible. So it seems like there's one extreme or the other that's necessary to make these friendships possible. And going back to what you were saying in sort of ancient cultures, one of the reasons why, Plato and Aristotle and so on thought about friendship in this very high-minded way was that they didn't think that their relationships with women, assuming that they were going to have these heterosexual romantic partnerships, they didn't assume that those relationships with women could be as meaningful, as cerebral as a friendship with a man. And in fact, they talked about how only men were capable of friendship. So the status of different genders comes into play in what friendship can mean. Yeah. And, it's complicated. It's not that we necessarily want to go back to the world where friendship was more significant if that means that you have to deride women in the process.
Absolutely. That's really well said. By the way, this ended well. I ended up flying to Luxor the next day and meeting up with my friend. We were united, and I have very fond memories of my time in Luxor with him. The other thing I wanted to say is we were talking about exemplars, and I think it's getting a little dated, but I think it's still relevant, is the movie Fight Club, as we talk about men, and how that resonated with so many men, in part because, it's just a fascinating story, but also this connection, not only between Tyler Durden and the narrator, but also this community of men who come together. And I'm curious, have you thought about that, considering this as have you been thinking about friendship?
So you are revealing my cultural incompetence. I obviously know what Fight Club is, the movie, but I haven't watched it. So I'm just going to add that to my list of things that I need to watch. It hasn't come up in conversations that I've had so far, but I'm sure if it spoke to you in the way that it did and made you think about friendship in this way, that I'm sure that there are plenty of others.
Yes, indeed. You'll see some of the topics that we've been talking about, the issue of hypermasculinity and so on, that's there. So we'll leave that, put a pin in it, as people like to say. Okay, so the last thing is I want to pivot us to this idea of making, maintaining, and perhaps ending friendships. As I listened to the article about men and loneliness, it was like, oh, there are people who are deficient. And I believe this is a skill, and it's a skill that can be developed. And what would you say to listeners who are inspired to make their team?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I've been actually reflecting a lot about this during the pandemic and learning things along the way. We talked about reliability and being able to see people frequently earlier. And I think we actually have quite an opportunity to deepen friendships or build them, because so many people are craving any kind of structure and ways to mark time. And I think finding some kind of shared activity where you can see somebody regularly is really valuable. This morning, I had a writing session with a friend of mine. We do a virtual writing session now 2 days a week, which started in the midst of the pandemic. And I started other kinds of regular calls with people, some of which are short, but they are ways of making sure that we are constantly in each other's lives and sort of not always in a place where we have to summarize what has happened before. And I think once you get used to seeing someone's face on screen or hearing someone's voice that often, it lowers the barrier to having longer conversations. I mean, there's a friend of mine who we've never lived in the same place, and we would catch each other in person when we were in the other's town. And because of the pandemic, it became like not that big of a deal to ask, you want to have lunch? And now we've done that pretty regularly. And I feel like I know so much more about her as a person. So I think the combination of people's craving for social connection and for structure can get people to get past their nervousness around trying to ask a new friend to spend more time together or to start to deepen an existing friendship.
Yeah, that's really nice. I'm like furiously writing some notes here. I think there is, as we think about, as you want to make this team, there's the starting friendships, and that's difficult, obviously. But there is this thing is like, we all have old friends. And why not just start by dusting off some old friendships, in a sense, as a good starting point? Like, you already know that person was a friend. They have appeal that might still be there. They're likely to be reliable, trustworthy, and anti-jealous. And so what's wrong with picking up the phone and giving an old friend a call? And then I like your idea of like frequency or regularity there. That seems like an easy place to start. I think that's a good tip in terms of scheduling. Get it on the calendar.
Yeah, I think getting it on the calendar is so important. And that some of the people who I've gotten to spend more time with over the pandemic, they were existing friends. And it was just, we started to find ways to be in each other's lives in more frequent ways. I don't think that frequency negates the need for depth, but I think when you're seeing somebody that often, then it's reminding you like, oh, do I actually know about what's happening in their life? Or are we just doing it? Like I've been like trying to get a meditation practice for years and years and years. And finally was like, I'm just going to like rope people in who I know also are trying to do the same thing. So I have 3 friends who we meditate like 3 times, do a short meditation 3 times a week. And we get a little bit about what's going on in each other's lives, but I know that that's not enough. And it spurs me to try to know more, because in those, how are people doing? We definitely can't get into it. And then I want to get into it at a different point. So that feels like something that is very doable for a lot of people.
And I just taped the Nietzsche episode, and Nietzsche believed that there was an optimal distance for friends, that the benefit of a friend is you don't necessarily live with the person. And so as a result, they have enough distance to let you have your individualism and your time and your space, but also they're close enough that they have this recognition. And so he was always worried about friends getting too close. In modern times, contemporary times, I'm concerned that friends are too far, right? So if you spend all your time with one person, you actually don't have anything new to talk about because you're both experiencing everything. If you never spend time with someone, all of the conversation are about these sort of big abstract things. There's something about the regularity of seeing Rhaina every week and saying, hey, how'd that conversation with your boss go? Because it's just detailed enough that's there.
So I think what you're pointing out about distance is really important. And One thing that actually reminds me of is the couple of friends, the men I was referring to earlier who get ribbed by the people in their life about, when are you going to like go leave your wives for each other. The two of them and one other friend of theirs, I think it's every Friday for the last 10 years, they've had a call with one other friend where they say they're high, they're low, and I think it's what they're looking forward to. And other people in their life know about that. And I think really have a lot of envy that because when you count up, those might be very brief calls and only talking about a few things, but that means that they know what is happening in each other's lives. And those like 500 calls, when they're accumulated, tell you so much about a person. And even that those sorts of short catch-ups can keep us from being constantly in a sort of catch-up mode rather than being in someone's life in real time. One thing that I really love are voice memos for this exact reason, which I know a lot of people have not actually tested out, but like on WhatsApp or Signal, iMessage, you can record something. So I had a thought that I wanted to send my friend at like 11:30 last night, and I wasn't going to call him about it. It wasn't that important, but I told him about a virtual event I'd been to and something that had made me think of him. And that wasn't me even telling him, I guess, that much about my life, but it was a way that I could just indicate with my voice, which is very intimate, I think more so than writing, that he's somebody who's in the back of my mind. And I'm sure it'll start a conversation about, how he thinks about fiction and poetry. And so I think there's also, in addition to the technology I was talking about with Zoom and ways that we can check in with each other, there are other things that are pretty low lift that allow us to reach out and have these experiences where instead of saying in the last 6 weeks, these are all the things that happened, that you have these shorter spurts that where you're working through some kind of problem or you're making some observation that make you feel like you're in the middle of the person's world and not just receiving the narration after the fact.
Yeah, I think that's really wonderful. Also, let's be honest, voice is more important than writing when it comes to relationships. And so with this focus on texting and the careful curation and choice of words, you do lack something that comes from voice and nuance and hearing someone. And I think you're right. You're pointing out some sort of easy, low lift ways to develop and maintain kind of relationships. But let's be honest, it is going to take work, right? There is an investment because of how important relationships are. As I like to say, anything worth doing is going to be difficult. And a friendship is worth doing, and there's going to be the cost of investing in it. And people seem really willing to invest lots and lots of time and energy in finding a life partner. Why would they not do this in terms of a potentially a life friendship?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are like the small hacks, and then there's like how are you? What is the shape of your thinking about your relationship? And I think you want to be, or I would like people more to be in a place where they are imagining that this is a relationship that is going to involve work, and there are rewards from working too. It's not just that you have to spend a lot of time and emotional energy on somebody. You get that in return when you see that when I edit my friends' applications or I help them with something that they're really having a hard time with, and then I see when they have a triumph and I'm excited on their behalf, or I'm having a lot of trouble with something and they come and help me. I think the idea that friendship is supposed to be easy and that if it's not easy, that something is wrong is pervasive and not really helpful for developing closeness. And that we don't expect that of any other close relationships in our lives. And it's not to say that people should put up with somebody who doesn't treat them well, but people have highs and lows, as we've all learned, especially during the pandemic, and not every friendship is going to be 100% always fun, but it's working through those difficulties with somebody that you care about that makes the relationship matter and feel like you can be there. Somebody will be there for you in the hard times, or with that question that you brought up that was in the Hidden Brain episode, like that you can call somebody in the middle when you are alone or afraid, that if you want that kind of support, that you will have to give it at some point.
Yeah, and I think that we are going, as we emerge from COVID, there's going to be possibilities. That is, people are going to start going out in the world, and there's a little bit of a fresh start. And this is a good time to start thinking about maybe starting some new friendships. So you said something about friends that are not good for you. And so this idea of sunsetting friendships, is that something that you've thought about or you've come across in your research and your thinking?
I've definitely come across this. I worked as an editor on an episode that had to do with kind of the life cycle of friendships, including ending them. And, it's something that even I find the idea of like having a conversation with somebody about like ending a friendship sounds incredibly hard to me. And I think one reason for it is that with a romantic relationship, which are for a lot of people are monogamous, to tell somebody, I don't want to date you is saying like, I don't want you to be the most important person in my life, essentially. To tell somebody that you don't want to be friends with them is basically to be like, I don't want you to be like among the 100 closest people, like people to me. And in some way that might be actually more painful for that person to hear. And I think it's also more difficult because we don't have a norm of friendship breakups. I mean, people definitely do have, I think we will hear of a falling out with a friend. Maybe
Yes.
that's like the closest kind of event that we're aware of. But even falling out there's not like a sense of agency in it. It's like everything combusted, and not that one person like decided they were going to tell this person how their relationship was changing. I think it's helpful to be talking about expectations in friendships so that you can be there for each other in good times. And it probably also makes it easier if you kind of want to downsize the friendship. And it's not just a matter of, do you never want to see each other again? But I think in some cases, friendships that were very important can become less important, or they can change. I mean, with my closest friend, when she was moved abroad and then was in her husband in a romantic relationship, and we had conversations about, well, what do we want to be to each other now? It's not that we still want to be very close, but how are the ways that we're going to communicate? How do we want them to change, as opposed to just observing that they're changing and not doing it with intention? So I think whether it is a kind of scale down or a shift, and to try to be kind to each other by behaving with intentionality rather than just kind of fading and never actually saying like what's going on in your life that means that maybe the relationship isn't going to be that important, particularly for close friendships. I think if it's something that's a little bit more marginal, then maybe those conversations aren't always necessary.
Yeah, indeed. I mean, I don't have a good answer to this. This is why I'm asking you. There is a little bit of this. If you stop trying, that is also just one of the ways that a friendship, as you said, becomes less prominent. There's another situation that pops into my head before we bring this to a close. And that is when you have a friend that you're losing to one of those relationship escalator situations. And I've seen the full gamut in my life. I've seen the friends who work very hard to maintain it through their marriage and so on. And I've had the friends disappear and then come back from the divorce. I tend to be rather accepting of these people and not resentful of it because I understand the system by which they're working. But I think there are times where a conversation redefining might be in order. I'm curious your thoughts about that.
I think having seen pretty early on in my adulthood or even childhood how people like friendships became significantly less important once they were in romantic relationships, really made me not want to reproduce that and to be trying to find people who would not do that to me.
The term disposable comes to mind, right? Like that you are being used and then thrown away once something more important comes along.
Or that there's a sense of like a boomerang, maybe that when you need them, they'll be back. Just thinking about one woman I interviewed who they were extremely close. Then the best friend had found a boyfriend and completely disappeared. And then when they broke up, was back in the friendship and as like excited as ever. And then, it was just the expectation was that that person was going to wait around. I mean, I think my ideas are basically predicated on having some amount of openness before that starts. I mean, it reminds me of this same friend who I was referring to. We have had a real like sort of exhilarating beginning to our friendship. And she, ever the practical one, was like, we're going to have to practice difficulty. Like we're going to have to practice like when hard things come into our relationship. And we just like couldn't imagine what that would look like, even though we knew that it would likely happen at some point. And I don't think we actually ever practiced having hard conversations in the way that she did. But when it was in a place where we had a conversation where she was like, my partner is now the photo on on the cover of my phone. But, and when it used to be the two of us, how do you feel about that? And we had different conversations about like how we've each felt about the friendship. And the reason we were able to do that is that we set the groundwork early on, and we had set some level of expectations about how important we were going to be in each other's lives. So if there was ever a feeling that there was a deviation from that, we could then have a conversation about it. So I guess maybe the main advice is like, piece of advice is if you haven't gotten to that point where one person is about to enter a romantic relationship, to try to set that groundwork so that you can have those conversations when life changes happen. And it might not be a romantic relationship, it might be moving or something like that. You know, if you're in the midst of it, I think many of us are inclined to just complain to the other friends in our lives rather than do the really hard thing, which is tell the person that I really care about you. And because I really care about you and our relationship, this is extremely hard for me. And I'm excited for you. I'm excited that this friendship can exist, but I also believe that I'm excited that you're so enthralled with this relationship, but that doesn't mean that our friendship can't still be a really prominent part of our lives. And maybe part of it is just helping that person interrogate their views about what a romantic relationship is and should be, because that person is not operating purely on their own hopes and choices, but within a world that tells them, well, this is what a romantic relationship should be. And in order to become close and have a successful romantic relationship, you need to dedicate a ton of time to it, which means it's a zero-sum game. And I think, I've obviously written about this topic, but I'm not the only one who's written and thought about the expectations we have around romantic relationships and how historically recent they are and how damaging they can be to the other relationships in our lives and to the kind of holistic support system that we would want to have, the team that you're talking about. And so, maybe situating that conversation about the particular relationship and how they think about the other relationships in their lives and what makes a successful romantic relationship could be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. I really feel for the people who are dealing with this sort of situation.
Yeah, with the loss and the grief of it and the potential for resentment. And also there is an empathy gap. Like people forget what it's like to be in love and how love bonds you in a way that crowds out a lot of relationships. And for better or for worse, that love and the intensity of it is fleeting. It doesn't last as long as we think it will, or as the fairy tales have told us that it will. Rhaina, so I think this is really great advice. I'm glad we're ending on this note. I think it feels like there is potential and possibility. If I could try to recap a few of the ideas just for the listeners, this idea of like, if you're looking to lean into friendships, this idea of starting with the old, I think is not a bad place because you have that kind of foundation. The value of voice, of being able to talk, whether it be in these sort of snippets, or a real deep conversation about even the value of the friendship and what are the hopes and expectations of it. And this notion, and you use the word intentional, the intentionality that you need to try. And that oftentimes the starting is the hardest part. And this came up in the episode on men and loneliness. And the research is that people think that starting is actually harder than it is. And that people are often really quite receptive to invitations to conversation and so on.
Yeah, as a social scientist, you might appreciate that one of my favorite all-time concepts is higher order beliefs. So basically what we believe about what other people believe. And this comes into play in this particular study that basically people are asked, like, do you think if you sat next to somebody on the train and you started a conversation with them that they would want to talk to you and would they enjoy it? And there's just this gap where people think that people are less interested in talking to them than they actually are. So, and they hold back as a result of that. So I think if everybody understood that actually people are pretty open to having those conversations begin and not assuming that the person next to you doesn't actually have any interest in getting to know a stranger, then we might be able to reach out more. So it's sort of an error in our judgments of what other people think that hinder our ability to connect. The one thing I wanted to underscore, and I think the summary that you gave definitely captures things well, is that if we think about our understanding of how romantic relationships work, we expect that you'll have conversations on the regular about the relationship, that it's not normal for things to go completely unsaid, whether that is on your first date saying whether you want to have kids or not, to like, are we going to be exclusive and this and that there, or how is the relationship doing? If you're having arguments, are you arguing well? Like we expect to have conversations about the relationship. And I think in friendships, we sort of expect everything to just go without those meta conversations. And if people could get used to that, I think that could enable deeper connection. I mean, I think about one conversation I had with a couple of friends where I asked them like if they wanted more physical affection in their friendships. And they both said yes. And then I said, well, would you feel comfortable initiating it? And they both said no, because they would feel sort of too awkward. And I think they would want some understanding that the other person wants the same thing that they do. But the only way that you know that is either one, that you initiate, or two, that you have a conversation about what is it that you want and need, and what can this relationship do for you. And that, I think, we don't expect to have that level of openness and conversation about the relationship when it comes to friendships, but we definitely are practiced in other areas of our lives, so we can bring those skills into friendship.
That's beautifully said, and I completely agree. I want to give people a tip if they want to start to do that, because I think that's hard. It's a big ask to have someone say, "So, Rhaina, let's talk about our friendship and how it's going." A nice entry point into this is something that I have done recently. I actually called a friend, an old friend, and I just simply said to him, I feel so lucky I met you. And then I told him why. And he said, that touches my heart. I just think that that's a good place to start to initiate those conversations that are there, because it just brings you, I just felt as close as I ever had to him at that moment.
Yeah. Without a doubt, the people who I've talked to who are in these platonic partnerships, extremely close friendships, they tell each other so much what they love about that person, how great they are. And I get to bear witness to that. And which is really lovely, but I don't know that we do that enough, and that we assume that the people in our lives know in what way they matter to us and how they affect us. And I hope that more people can tell somebody how much that person means to them. Because if you're on the other side of it, I think you can imagine how important that would feel and how much that would make you feel connected to that friend.
Yes. Rhaina, I really appreciate your time. This is a wonderful conversation. It's an important conversation, and it's one that I hope more and more people will have.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for being vulnerable. I think you're modeling the exact kind of behavior that people need to actually have relationships that matter, that are meaningful.
Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to Solo, the single person's guide to a remarkable life. For more about our guests and show notes, go to petermcgraw.org. Please subscribe and share with your single friends.